Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz, and this season we will be unpacking real trends, hot topics in the workplace around allyship and inclusion. Our goal is that each week you leave with tangible tools, information, practical strategies that you can take back to allies at your organization. Let's dig in to this week's topic. Hey allies, I have with me this week a special guest, Dr. Michelle Quist Ryder, and she is a social psychologist, research professional, and the CEO of the American Psychological Foundation, an organization that leverages the power of philanthropy to invest in research and advance psychological knowledge. Dr. Ryder has an extensive background in human-centric organizational design, effective DEI practices, and leveraging psychology to solve critical societal issues. So I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Ryder to the show. Hi, Michelle. How are you?
Hi, Julie. I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on the show today.
Yeah, well, I would love to dig into research and get a little nerdy with psychological trends and things. But before we do that, I would love to hear how you found your way into this work.
Wonderful. Yeah. So it's sort of a roundabout story, honestly. I knew that I really loved psychology for a long time. Most people do like psychology, though. When you start learning about psychology, you find out that it's the study of people, and you learn stuff about yourself, and you learn things about everybody that's around you, and so it's really interesting. And I kind of followed that path as well, thinking that it was interesting. But then when you get into it, there's this question of, well, what do I do with this? So I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with it at first. And I went into kind of some counseling, because when you think about psychology, you think about counseling. So that's where I went first. And as I was going through that, I said, you know what, this actually isn't for me. Because I don't know if anyone ever told you, but if you are a counselor and you give your patient some advice, they don't actually have to take it. They don't have to do what you
Right.
say. They can choose not to. And so I said, you know what, maybe this isn't for me. But I was really interested still in psychology. And so I kind of did some other things and just kind of made it a hobby. I started a bookkeeping business. I went through IT. I went through a bunch of different places. I did some marketing and tourism, but psychology really stuck with me. So I decided to go ahead and get my graduate degree. So I went and got my graduate degree in social psychology, and I studied motivation, and I started teaching. And I was professor at University of Houston first while I was getting my PhD, and then at Penn State University. And I liked teaching, but I just kind of wanted a little bit more. I wanted a little bit more interacting with people, a little bit more impact of psychology, what we could do with it. So I applied to the American Psychological Foundation, first working in the programs department, and then I became CEO. So that's what brought me here today.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah. So it's like you were in the trenches, kind of doing the work as a counselor, and then as a teacher, and then finding your way to like the purposeful work and moving your way through the organization. I always love those career stories where people find their purpose and passion and try on some different things to get there because it's not a ladder. It's a lot of crossing back and forth and almost like a triangle anymore career path. So thanks for sharing that, Michelle. I'd love to talk through, you know how you've seen organizations that have, psychological safety and human-centric org design. These things sound great in academic world, but like how practically does that manifest? Like how do organizations take actionable steps to create, workplaces where people really can thrive?
That's a good question. If I were to answer it, the short answer, I would say it's really about individualization of your employees, of looking at them, each person with their specific circumstance, and trying to meet them where they're at. But that obviously is too simplistic of an answer, too. It's one of those things that it's easy to say, but difficult to do. So when we're talking about inclusivity, diversity, equity, inclusivity, all of those things, it's can be kind of a catch 22, because those are not part of our mainstream ideals. That's one of the reasons we have to focus on it, that we have to include those ideals because it's not part of the mainstream ideals. So it won't change unless we focus on it. All of our systems, all of our structures, they are built around preserving what's good for the majority. So we have to take those systems and structures on by themselves, and which means we have to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion and all of those different things. But when we focus on them, then we are also reinforcing the other. We're reinforcing it's us versus them, the majority versus the minority. And so that's kind of reinforcing that stereotype mentality as well, that thought of thinking about their other, and I'm thinking about meeting their needs instead of quote unquote our needs. And so that can be a challenge when you're looking at including diversity, equity, and inclusion ideals, is how do I make that change, but then make it part of just the daily mechanisms? How do I make that part of my system and my structure? So when I look at that in as it comes to the workplace, it really comes down to, I think, looking at your policies and thinking about what pieces of these policies are absolute. Do I need to keep the way that they are? And how can I make some of these policies flexible so that they can account for the largest group of people, so that I can change details about them to include those people that wouldn't be served by just sort of this blanket policy that goes across everybody? I'll give an example. At APF, we've been looking at maternity leave and figuring out, okay, how can I best serve those who are going on maternity leave? And when you take maternity leave, often it's based on short-term disability. So you take short-term disability, and then how can I work with my employees so that we can get them 100% pay? Can we take some of the other employees to take on some of the burden so we don't have to hire somebody? So we're just working through all of these things to get this maternity leave paid. And as I'm going through this, I realize, there's other reasons that people take short-term disability. It's not just because of maternity leave, right? So someone else who is taking short-term disability might need some of this flexibility as well. So I just took the maternity leave name off of that policy and said, you know what, this is actually a short-term disability extension policy. This is anybody who needs to use short-term disability can pull this up and say, you know what, I can do this too. I can fill out the requests in this model so that I can get 100% pay while I'm on short-term disability as well. So it's that kind of thing where you look at this policy and you say, how can I form this so that it helps the most amount of people without making someone come to me and ask for an exception or ask for
Right.
me to change the rules? I want to make it as broad as I can so that it will fit a lot of people's circumstances while still meeting my need as an organization.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think even broader than that, it's intersectional disability, LGBTQ plus, adopting children, it's so much more vast when we broaden the umbrella. And I think what it does nicely, Michelle, is it helps prevent this narrative of the zero-sum game. Oh, well, only women are benefiting from this policy, and I have to have a child to get it. And what if I don't have children? So I think so much of the DEI crosshairs that we're seeing right now is the zero-sum mentality, which you and I know it doesn't work that way. The rising tide typically does lift all boats, not to use a dated metaphor, but it's true.
Right.
What benefits some benefits all. And we shouldn't rely on individuals to have to advocate for themselves. It's uncomfortable and not inclusive as well. So we need to be making those systems changes, like you said. One thing I think I find interesting in this work too, and where we're at right now, is, I think about the modern workplace and when it was really created, post-World War II, 1950s, which you and I know, there weren't a lot of women, let alone people of
Mm-hmm.
color in office jobs. And that's changed so drastically, right, in the 70 plus years, but the systems haven't. Um, I wonder how we help people see how the workplace was built for you, the very people that are in the dominant group that we need to change the systems so they work better for everyone. It's quite the conundrum we're in. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely it is. I think, like I said, we have to address this at the systemic and structural level. And I think that that includes bringing everybody into this mindset. I was at a workshop once when they were talking about DEI initiatives, and the person leading the workshop said, "You know, we always consider diversity initiatives, or I see diversity initiatives being considered as something that's on top of everything else you're doing. It's something you're doing in addition, but it's not part of your work. It's the frosting on the cake." And what we need to realize is that these initiatives are actually like the eggs that go in the cake. It needs to be baked through everything that you do. And I think that's really the key of what we're looking at. We need to get everybody involved. And to do that, you have to realize what you're missing when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion. Why are those things good for your company, not just politically, not just for to please your customers or anything like that, but what are the benefits of diversity, equity, inclusion? Because we do see them. When you look in the research, you see people who have these initiatives and they're successful, they do better with their customers, they broaden their perspectives, they're more creative, they're more successful. All of these reasons that DEI is really beneficial for companies. And I think you're exactly right. And when we see this pushback against DEI, it's because people are sinking into that "how does this help me" mentality. This we are giving them this unfair advantage. First of all, it's that us versus them again, right? You're now thinking about
Right.
us being the people who used to benefit, and then them being the people that we want to benefit now. And when we're talking about including the diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're talking about it from this assumption that the value of that is included in that language, because the people who promote diversity, equity, and inclusion understand why that is such a good thing to promote. But when you're telling other people about it without talking about why this is good, then it becomes this us versus them, what do I get out of it kind of mentality. So I think education is a huge part of it. People to understand why this is important before they have to engage in it. And then also, if you talk about diversity initiatives, don't just say in your company, "This is what I'm going to do," and then force it through, but instead look at, and how is this helping? How is this actually helping us on the other side? Measure those variables, look at those variables. So get everybody involved, everybody to understand what you're doing, what those systems and structures are, I think is the first part. And it's worked somewhat when we look at, I just actually wrote an article, I think it's coming out in February or March of next year, but um, this article about women in the workplace and how women left the workplace during COVID, this mass exodus, and now people are trying to get them back into the workplace. And one of the things that they look for when they're finding a new job is, what is your diversity, equity, and inclusion policies?
Yep.
How are you bringing those people in? So we know that we have some people coming in, because women are kind of on the cusp. In the 50s, yeah, we weren't necessarily included in the workplace very much. And now we're sort of in the majority in a lot of ways. So we're sort of in the majority in some ways, and in some ways we're still struggling for that, right? And so we see this group that's kind of on the cusp, that's still in the majority, saying, "You know what? I see the benefit of this for everybody. So I want to work in a place that has that." So if we can get people to understand their place in that system and understand how they benefit as well, basically that their boat is going to rise in that tide, then I think we can get people on board. And it really is going to take everybody understanding what it is, why we're doing, or what it is, why it is that we are recommending the things that we are, to get everybody involved in that system and structure. But then past that, I think the important part is to not focus on the fact that this is a DEI initiative, especially now because it's being challenged so much, but look at it as a people-focused initiative. This is something I'm doing for all of my employees. And knowing when you're putting it together that you are helping everybody, look at it as that person-centric, employee-centric workplace where you are going to account for everybody to the best of your ability. Because another piece of this is that DEI, we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we might focus solely on visual diversity or gender diversity, but really diversity is huge, right? When we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are so many groups that we're talking about, but not all of those groups are served by the same policies or the same ideals. So when we look at it at a policy basis or as a person-centered thing, we can address the needs of all of those groups without trying to lump them together and say, well, you're not us, you're them, and all of them is the same. So that was a
Yeah.
really long-winded answer to your question.
No, I mean, it does. It falls back on education, awareness. I mean, I think for folks that have been on the DEI journey for a long time, it just feels like, why do we keep having to slow down to catch everybody else up, you know? And I also think, in addition to the zero-sum game mentality that's happening right now, that us versus them, there's this lived experience gap where I haven't had that lived experience. I didn't, I got a job, no problem. I got promoted, no problem. I had mentors, I had sponsors, I had advocates. No one microaggressed me. It's almost like this like lack of belief, like that it
Mhm.
happens to other people. And I kind of say that facetiously because, women were usually like, yeah. Folks of color are like, oh my gosh, well, welcome to my world. That is not what happens, disabilities, etc. So I just wonder what it's going to take because right now DEI is still so voluntary inside organizations. And we know making it mandatory as far as training goes tends to create more of a backlash. I just wonder what it's going to take for folks that, I kind of call them the murky middle, the magic middle, we can call them whatever we want. There's really folks that don't get it because they haven't had the lived experience and they maybe haven't been as curious to try to understand it, why we need to do things differently. Like why it worked for you, but it won't work for other people. Thoughts on that, Michelle?
Yeah, I think that's also a good question. And I do hear the first comment that you made about people who have been working for DEI, working towards DEI for so long, saying, why am I still having to say this? And even as I'm talking about we need to educate people, I can feel someone listening to that who's been educating people for decades and thinking, what else can I do? And getting frustrated. So I can hear that even as I'm talking about that's what we should do. So I definitely feel that. And I think one of the problems we're running up against is the lack of experience, like you're talking about, lack of lived experience. I haven't been in those shoes. I haven't experienced that. But I think part of that is not wanting to acknowledge that those things are happening because you have the privilege not to. You have this ability to just say, yeah, I believe that that happens, but I don't want to think about it too much because it takes me a lot of energy. It takes me a lot of exhaustion. You have people who, the murky middle, who just don't want to address that because they are busy in their normal lives. They've got their own problems and they just want to move forward. And I wish it wasn't like that. I wish that we had people who would say, yes, this is absolutely the right thing and I'm going to fight for it. And but there's the ideal reality and then there's reality. And so I think that we still fight the fight in educating people 100%. We still do that. We still talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We still put out the articles and talk about the lived experience and make it so that it's harder for people to hide from it and that they understand that reality. But then on the backside of that, I think we have to solve the systemic and the structural issues. We have to look at it at what's propping up all of these systems, especially in the workplace. Like you mentioned, the workplace put together kind of in the 50s and it hasn't changed a lot since then. But in the last few years, we've seen sort of this revolution in the workplace where during COVID, everybody worked from home, or those who could in the industries that you work from home. There was this mass exodus. Everybody worked from home. And come to find out, work still happened. People were still successful. Companies were still successful. And so I think that kind of cracked the egg a little bit where people are saying, well, if I can work from home and still be successful, what other things are happening in my organization that I don't actually have to do for my organization to be successful? What other policies can we look at? So now we have, when it just comes to workplace location and workplace time, we've got flex time, we've got still work from home, we've got hybrid, we have all of these different models kind of emerging that are serving the employee better. And I think that's what we need to look at our policies and say, what is here just because it's always been here, but it's not serving our organization anymore. And I think that's how you break down the systems and the structure, by looking at what's there that doesn't have to be, that you've just been reinforcing because you've always done it that way. That's what tradition says. I think we need to spend some time and some effort looking at that. And as we're identifying those systems and those structures, as we're rebuilding those systems and those structures, that's when we can say, okay, how do I rebuild this in such a way that it is more inclusive, that that DEI initiative isn't something I'm trying to force in from the top, but it's something that I'm building as I'm putting my structure back together, that I include that. It's going to broaden to help all of those people. It's all of those people that we would have considered them before. How do we just make it all us? And we're going to help everybody. And as you're doing that, it's not that you're trying to change a system in such a way from the outside that you're telling someone, I'm going to force you to take this initiative in what you're already doing. You're changing things anyway. So that gives you a chance to bake it in there without sort of hammering somebody on the head with it and making them face it.
Yeah.
Absolutely keep the education up, but then work in the background too, and shift it as a leader in your organization from the top down. Shift those systems and structures so that you bake them in anyway.
Yeah, I love that, Michelle. Yeah, the embed strategy definitely works better than the top down or bottom up or
Right.
sideways approach. Just get it embedded, and it's kind of like you said, add the eggs while you're cooking. It's not put them on top. You're baking.
Right.
It's in the sauce. It's in the batter. We rarely get to talk with folks with a psychological background like you have, that deep expertise. I'm just curious, what are some tools that we can borrow from psychology to maybe help us along our ally journeys? I know, stereotype threat and, other concepts that originated in psychology can be borrowed for this work. Where do you see the intersection?
So I personally think all of psychology helps. I think that knowledge and just learning about psychological theories, anything that you can learn to that helps you understand why you're thinking the way that you're thinking, especially if you get into understanding how your brain works and how you make associations and how you shortcut your way through life because of those associations, because it's more convenient. We talk schemas and heuristics, all of those. So I would encourage everybody just get some basic psychological knowledge, because it helps you go through life. When it comes through diversity and equity and inclusion, though, I like that you brought up the stereotype threat model. That is one of my favorite things that I used to teach about when it comes to stereotype threat. So the stereotype threat model, it's Claude Steele, is a social psychologist, and he had this theory and did research around it, and then wrote a book called Whistling Vivaldi. And so the stereotype threat model basically says that we are all we there are attributes that people will associate with us because of whatever category they put us in, whatever stereotypes they have about us. They will put us in that model, and then they will assume those things about us. But we are also impacted by that model. When people tell us, well, this is what your group can or can't do. For example, there was he did a study where he sent women into math tests. And if they are primed with the stereotype that women can't do math, they would do worse on that math test. But if they're not primed with that, then they don't. They perform just as well as men. So when we look at that stereotype threat, that actually becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of, we act that way, people treat us that way, we think that that's true. And his study was really interesting in that all it took was telling them, that's not true here. What they did is they took women then into this math test, and they said, we know you've heard this theory that women aren't as smart as math and as smart as men in math. And what we can tell you is that in this test, that isn't true. This test has been made such that stereotype does not come out. And this test, women perform just as well as men. And then at the end of that study, it was true. The women perform just as well as the men. So it's not about what we what we're actually doing. It's about what our excuse me, what perspectives are driving our actions and what we believe about ourselves and other people. Another thing, the reason he called his book Whistling Vivaldi, another really interesting story. It was this young Black man in graduate school, and he would walk down the street and be whistling Vivaldi. And the reason was is because he knew what kind of assumptions people were going to make about him being a young Black man walking down the street. But if he just whistled classical music, it would disrupt the way that people thought about him and cause them to be like, oh, wait, no, he might be okay. Because they make this other association with classical music and it disrupts the stereotype. So that's one of the things I love about the stereotype threat model is because it explains so much about how we act about ourselves and how we can break those stereotypes that we are telling ourselves that impacting the way that we are working, but also it looks at us, it tells us how we are looking at other people and how we can break that stereotype and action down as well. What assumptions am I making about that person? And how can I bring those to the forefront and make sure that I'm pointing out internally what are assumptions that I'm making versus what has this person demonstrated to me? What do I actually know about them? I think that is just incredibly helpful for the people who are willing to be internal and look at their own behavior.
Yeah, it's good self-perception. Like it reminds me of the data on self-awareness, just how very few people are actually self-aware. And no one thinks they're biased. Nobody thinks they're judging a Black man and the music that they should or should not be humming or singing to, but we do it. We do it subconsciously, and that stereotype threat, we've got to interrupt it. It reminds me of the research when you remind people of their biases before performance reviews and hiring
Mm-hmm.
decisions so they're less likely to act on those biases. I had a session today, quite candidly, where it was a mixed gender group. It was about DEI, and we split the groups in twos, and I called on the men first. And I just thought, oh, shoot, I called
Mm-hmm.
myself out. I was like, I think I'm being a little biased right now. Please, someone else participate. But there's also just a natural willingness to
Uh-huh.
participate because the workplace was designed for me. And so I'll speak up, and it just like I feel like we chase our tail sometimes with this work. It can go in circles, and we
We
need
absolutely do.
we need more allies. And that's why it's so important, the work that you all are doing, Michelle. I wonder if you had any predictions or thoughts for the future of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Of course, right now, people are so worried about the words we use. I don't honestly care. I just want us to do the work.
Right.
What are your thoughts on where we go from here?
Um, honestly, I wish I could say that it's rosy from here on out. We're going to build it in, everything's going to be great, but I really can't. And I think my prediction, honestly, is that we're going to kind of continue on this pendulum. Right now, people are attacking the words. And so I think in order to move forward, we are probably going to have to lay off the words and we're going to have to look at this system and structural problems. And I think we will make headway. I think we have made headway. If you look at the difference between the workplace now and the workplace that it was in the 50s, it's very different. So even though it feels like we're fighting the same fight over and over, we have made progress and we will continue to make progress. And the 50s were what, 75 years ago now? In 75 years from now, it will look very different than it does right now. So I think we focus on the fact that we are making progress. But for now, we probably have to shift away from these terms and start focusing on the system and the structure. And I think we will make a difference in the system and the structure. We are going to have an impact and things will get better. But at some point, it's going to coalesce around the majority again, because that's what always happens, because that's human nature. So once it starts coalescing around the majority again, we're going to have to start bringing up these words. It's going to have to start talking about inclusion. We're going to have to start pointing out the people who aren't included. And it might be different when we think about people who weren't included before in decades and decades ago. We look at Irish people and Italian people who both used to be oppressed, and now they're not. And we look at just the different, really, honestly, the people who comprise the minorities have sort of been different groups at different times, depending on what it is that we're facing at that time and who we consider the boogeyman to be. I mean, that's a whole nother psychological theory and topic. But anyway, so I think that we will make progress. And then when we get to the point again that it stalls there, that systemic structural reconditioning that we're doing, we've kind of gotten to the end of that, and people are getting tired of that, and they're starting to call that out, and they're saying, oh, I don't like this, all whatever words we come up with that's going to talk about that, they will not like those words anymore. But at that point, it's time to shift back to, okay, who are we not including now? Who's on the outside now? And how can we bring them back in? And
Yeah.
that's honestly, that's my prediction for the future, is that this will be an ongoing battle. It's the people involved might change, the groups involved might change, but we are always going to have to be looking at who's a majority and who are we leaving out and how can we fix that?
Yeah. I love that. Who's not included? Yeah. Great, simple question and easy to refute challenges. That's what I'm looking for is how do we refute unnecessary challenges? I'm fine with being challenged in the work, but when it comes from a place of unwillingness to understand and a lack of curiosity, then I tend to have issues.
Yes. That is,
Um,
I think, the disease plaguing us, is the people who are unwilling to engage, unwilling to see how it can be helpful, unwilling to self-reflect. And the layer of defensiveness, I think, is another thing. And
yeah,
that is probably the advice I would give people who want to be allies, is check your defensiveness. If someone
yeah,
starts saying, like, for example, your example, Julie, when you said I'm calling on the men first, if someone says to you, hey, I've noticed you've been calling on the men first, is it okay if we mix that up? For you not to immediately castigate yourself and say, oh my gosh, I'm the worst, and how could I have done that, and I'm so sorry, and then start thinking about excuses, which of course I'm not saying you did any of that. I'm just saying that that is our normal and natural reaction when someone calls us out, is to apologize profusely and figure out why we did that and what our excuses are and all of that. No, don't do any of that. Just say, I'm so glad you pointed that out. I'm going to make that change right now, and then change it and move on. I think that is one of the things that people can, that's a skill that people can work on right here and right now. And start moving forward with that by just not being defensive, because it does happen to all of us. I'm a social
right.
psychologist, and I used to teach people about stereotype and bias in all of this. And I'll tell you, we were in a group recently of people, psychologists from APA, and someone pointed out to me that I was calling all of the men using doctor in their last name, and I was calling all the women by the first name.
Yeah,
So,
I
you know,
know.
I know that. And that's something that I've seen before, and yet I fell into that trap. And so
Yep, I do
anybody
it
can do
too.
it. Yeah, and that's what it takes, is for us to notice it in other people, and then allow ourselves to fall and then to get back up, to say, I noticed that I did that, and I'm going to be conscientious about making a change.
Totally, totally. I love that. I love that. Great perspective and vulnerability, Michelle. We all just gotta be okay being imperfect. Ugh, so sick
Yes.
of this whole idea that we have to be perfect and modeling that for others so that the people we need to be most imperfect can show up, hopefully a little more safely. Well, great
Absolutely.
conversation today. So thankful for the work you do. Tell our listeners how they can follow your work.
Yes, absolutely. So we have our website. It's ampsychfdn.org. So please come look at what the foundation is doing. We have all of the grants that people can apply for, scholarships, fellowships, all of those things. And we also do collect the research that we do, and we highlight some of that research. We highlight our researchers. You'll see articles that I've written. You'll see stuff from our trustees, all of that stuff. So come to our website, definitely, and check it out.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the important work you do, Dr. Ryder, not Michelle. And thanks for all the great tips. It's a pleasure to share your story on the podcast.
Wonderful. Thanks, Julie. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. My hope is that you walked away with a tangible tool insight or information that you can share with other allies on the journey. If you liked this week's episode, please leave us a review. Your feedback means a tremendous amount to us. We'll be back next week with another hot topic.